is a friend of mine, friend for many years, Ken Davis. He was part of the Meath County family, who've done so much great work in the town. And just a point that if anybody doesn't have that centenary book that they produced many, many years ago, it's the most valuable source of history. It's incredible. I've been speaking about it quite recently, and it's now becoming quite hard to get. And it's a credit to David's family and Ken for doing such a wonderful job. So Ken is going to talk to us today on one of, I suppose, a fantastic subject, the furniture industry in Ireland, in Navan, and it deserves, he's writing a book about it, and it deserves to be recorded and recognised. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Ken Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see so many people here. So wood and wool, two of the elemental ingredients that go into making furniture and carpets. We're going to break it down into two separate sections. We are under time constraints, so I'll do my best to get through it in the time that I've been allocated. The chair, by the way, that I've used to illustrate the first slide is a Windsor chair number 5 that was made in the furniture factory of William Walsh & Co. Boyne Mills in Navan. Probably dated from about the 1950s, more of which later. So one of the more fanciful theories that I've come across as to why furniture started up in Navan was that it all began after the big wind of January 1839, when the locals made great use of all the fallen timber around the town. Now, the big wind in 1839 was probably the greatest natural disaster to ever befall these islands, and you could legitimately ask, it knocked trees, didn't just knock trees around Navan, it knocked trees everywhere around the country by tens of thousands. So you could legitimately ask, why didn't furniture start everywhere? I think it's probably safe to file that one away under folklore, which is a pity actually, because it would have made a wonderfully romantic introduction to the story. The reality is a little bit more mundane. The furniture industry in Navan actually started in a sawmill. This one right here, at Delaney Mill, and it is the cradle of where Navan's furniture industry was born. It started out, lots of you probably know where this is. If you travel, for those that don't, if you travel at the Boyne Road towards St Mary's Cemetery, and just before you come to the cemetery on the left-hand side, there's a steep laneway, twisty laneway down to the River Boyne and the Boyne Canal. And there's a small little bridge that straddles the canal. And on top of that bridge sat this massive edifice, 6 stories high. It was originally a flax mill, built by a man called John Blundell from Lancashire in 1806, 1807. And it flourished throughout the 1800s for a lot of the time, but it fell into decline in the late 1800s, and by late 1890s it was essentially derelict. But its fortunes were transformed by the arrival in Navan of the nationalist MP James McCann, who was from County Louth originally, but he was a wealthy stockbroker, and he liquidated his stocks and shares and bought large tracts of land around Navan, including the mill here and a smaller mill just a short distance away from it. He converted the smaller mill into a bacon factory and the large mill into a woodworking enterprise and a sawmill, called it Lonely Sawmill. McCann was a guy ahead of his time, really, but unfortunately he didn't live very long. He died in 1904 in his 60s, but his family ensured that the momentum that he'd created in relation to enterprise continued and was fulfilled. And in 1906, thanks to his sons Arthur and John and 2 other directors, Michael O'Dea and James Sheridan, they transformed the Athlone Sawmill into the Navan sawmill and furniture factory. And if you're looking for a point in time when the Navan furniture industry was born, that's it, November 1906. And the tradition of wood craftsmanship first fostered in the Navan sawmill and furniture factory contributed to a large extent to Navan's significance as a furniture manufacturing centre. So Navan's first furniture makers, of which there were about 70 to 100, went from making wooden boxes, crates, wooden axles, coffins, fencing and that kind of stuff, to more sophisticated products for the home, like drawing room suites and dining room suites. 7-piece suite was a thing in those days. So the McCanns had the factory until about 1912, when it was purchased by the Goodar brothers. Now the Goodar brothers were from a place called High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire in England, which is the home of English furniture. So they really knew what they were about. So they developed the business further. They really liked the look when they came to visit it first. They had done some business in Ireland in around that time, so they really liked the look of the place when they bought it. But it had a large amount of water power from the mill wheel, and wonderful transit facilities as well. The Boyne Canal to draw to port, and Navan was also a considerable rail hub at that time. So they spent a number of prosperous years making Windsor chairs, among other things. They also made large quantities of tent pegs for the British Army during World War I. They also left behind a wonderful selection of photographs, one of which you can see here from the inside of the factory. But as time went on, the Irish Revolutionary period developed, particularly around 1918 and the general election of that year. There was a lot of intimidation, particularly on the part of Sinn Féin, and the Goodar brothers were essentially told to go back to where they came from, and they did. So into the breach stepped Daniel Aylesbury, and that's Daniel top right. Daniel and his brother John Aylesbury were also English, actually, Quakers from Bristol, and they started the Edenderry timber mills in the late 1890s, I think, and so they bought the factory, again developed it, continued on. In 1926, Joseph Connolly became the managing director. Connolly was a political figure as well as a businessman. He was born in Belfast, had been in the furniture trade himself, but he also became a senator in the late 1920s, and he was actually Minister for Posts and Telegraphs in Eamon de Valera's government in 1932. Wrong way. Well, the business that Connolly actually took over was in quite bad shape at that stage. Aylesbury's Edenderry factory in particular was heavily indebted, and the place had been kept going by help of a government-backed trades loan of about £28,000, which was supposed to have been used to modernise and capitalise the factory in Edenderry. Instead, it was used basically to pay down debt. So when he took it over, it was in trouble. The Navan factory was a much more profitable operation. So he takes a difficult decision in August 1931 to close the Edenderry factory, which obviously led to a great deal of anger and hostility in the streets of Edenderry, particularly when the furniture making equipment and plant was attempted to be moved from Edenderry to Navan. So the Navan factory is now the main operation, and they had a lot of contracts with the big Dublin furnishing houses. They also did a lot of work for the Board of Works. So it was quite a good operation, and there were 120 people employed in it. But calamity in 1933, a week before St Patrick's Day, when the factory burns down. Obviously, complete desolation. 120 jobs are gone, and efforts in Navan to restart the business failed. Efforts were led mostly by Navan Urban District Council. There was one company from Lisburn, James Duff and Sons, who were cabinet making works, who were kind of interested in maybe taking it over, but in the end they abandoned the plan. So The only people to actually start up directly after Aylesbury's mill burned down were William Darker. William Darker was the general manager in Aylesbury's at the time of the fire, so he was probably in a better position than most to actually start a business. And he started Darker's cotton making factory on Mill Lane, and he was succeeded in that business by his sons Harold and Gordon in years, and held for a long number of years. The other people were the Moran brothers, Patrick, Benny and Frank, and they started up their business at the back of their house at the factory village and were quite successful from the start. So I suppose the fire of 1933 was the catalyst that kind of hastened the expansion of the furniture industry in Navan in the years that followed, as a wave of skilled craftsmen were unleashed onto the local labour market. And I suppose to fully understand that last statement, we need to kind of circle back a few years and meet a trio of gentlemen that I call the Divine Trinity: Bard, Hogg and Elliot. So Joshua Elliot arrived in Navan from County Antrim in the early 1900s, got a job in the Navan Sawmill and Furniture Factory, befriended Thomas Mortimer, who was the general manager of the plant, and when Mortimer left the Navan Sawmill in 1908 to start his own business, Mortimer's Sawmill on the Mollies, Joshua Elliot went with him. And then when Thomas Mortimer died in 1914, Joshua took over the business, and that became, well, it was known as Blackwater Sawmills, but it was also known probably more colloquially as Elliot Sawmills. Elliot wasn't a furniture maker by strictly speaking per se, but I have included him because he is a very important part of the early story of the furniture industry in Navan, not only as a supplier of the raw material to the factories, but also himself and his family also took a stake in one of the other businesses later on, which was quite a significant move. The emergence of William Walsh, Bard Walsh, can be traced back to 1928 when he starts his own business on Flower Hill in the backyard of his brother Tommy's house. And he would actually make the chairs in the backyard and put them out in the street on the front of the thatched house to sell. He was an ex-Aylesbury's man, a chair maker, and a pretty good one by all accounts. But he was also hugely ambitious. I mean, within a few years of starting out on his own, he had leased Blackcastle Mill, which was on Blackcastle Avenue where the Poolboy apartments are, and he had 40 men working for him. Like, all of a sudden, 2 years later, he had 60 men working for him. By 1935, another couple of years later, he had 135. So, I mean, by any modern day metric, his growth was absolutely explosive. And he was at that stage, by 1935, the largest chair maker in the Irish Free State. So a very significant figure. His neighbour from Flower Hill, John Hogg, another ex-Aylesbury's man and upholsterer, starts business in 1930 at Blackcastle Sawmills, which was up beside the round O at the top of Flower Hill. Again, he grew relatively quickly. He started out with 2 men and 1 machine. A year or two later, he had 24 men and 10 machines. And within 7 or 8 years, he had 86 people working for him. So they became the 2 big furniture factories throughout the 1930s and the 1940s. Bard moved from Blackcastle Avenue to Boyne Mills across the river, where the River Millview apartment complex is situated today. And Hogg went to Watergate Mills just off the bottom of Watergate Street. And the reason their workforces grew exponentially like that was because they gradually absorbed all the skilled workers from Aylesbury's who found themselves out of work after the fire. So in the 1940s, obviously nothing, certainly in the early 1940s, not a lot happened because of the war. Things were pretty difficult for everybody. But as soon as 1945 comes, there's a flurry of activity. John Hogg moves to a new purpose-built factory on the Dublin Road in 1945. He vacates Watergate Mills, where he had been for the previous 10 years, and Moore and Brothers move from the factory village, their little workshop out there, into Watergate Mills, and they remain there for the next 35 years. At their highest point, they probably employed about 88 people. Bard Walsh, and let's see if this works. So this is Bard's factory here. He built a large extension here in 1945 as well. He actually had a plan to build an entirely new purpose-built factory at the back of Connolly Avenue, and bought land to do it. But for some reason that deal didn't happen, fell through. So instead he increased the footprint of Boyne Mills up there. So the other large factory that kind of started in that period of time was Navan Joinery and Furniture Works. So Peter Garrity was a businessman in Navan at that time, coal merchant. He started a joinery business on the Trim Road in 1947. He had been widowed at a relatively early age and was left with a young family, but he remarried a lady called Annie McLarney, who was Bard Walsh's secretary and office manager, and he installed her as manager in that business, and she utterly transformed it. She was a human dynamo. She transformed it into a proper furniture factory, and it became the fourth big factory of that era. At the same time, there were smaller outfits happening. So Michael Riley, the gunner Riley, had a small little workshop just about there, across the road from Bard Walsh's. Christy McIntaggart had a place bankrolled by his father Benny, who was a building contractor on Convent Road. Jodie Clark started a place on Mull